Hey, what's up, everybody? I am, for those of you that don't know me, I am Bob, the founder of RetroRGB.com, which is a website, a podcast, a YouTube channel, some behind-the-scenes research. And it started out as just a website to get the absolute best quality out of your classic consoles. And that lasted very shortly until I realized a much better goal is getting the best experience from your consoles. Because everybody has different needs, everybody doesn't need a perfect setup, but there is a big difference between a good setup and a bad setup, and price has nothing to do with it. And that's kind of what this panel is about. Yeah. Sorry, I've been talking all day, so gonna have a few beer breaks in this, but. There we go. So this panel I've been doing for the better part of the year, and I usually carry CRTs with me, and people really get a good sense of the difference between things. But now this is going to eventually be a video, hopefully by the end of the year. So I switched it over to be slideshow based, and because I got to kind of practice for the video. But everybody's feedback at all of these panels has been absolutely amazing, and it's helped me really fine tune it. So I'm doing a Q&A after, so any feedback on this is always much appreciated. But to start out, the comparison I always like to make between classic consoles is classic cars. Because you don't need to know anything about cars or even like them in order to get some of the main differences. First is that when a console or a car is new, it's shiny and people want to use it, and it's new and flashy. But then after a while, it just kind of becomes junk that gets sold off at bargain prices. But then some of them, some consoles and some cars, are realized as classic and the things that people want to restore and to really appreciate. But a much better comparison between the two is nobody would buy a classic car just because they need to get to the store. You buy a classic car because that's the experience you want to have while you're driving. And that's exactly what people who use original consoles want. And it's the experience of what that's like. Now, in order to explain what that experience is, I have to get a little bit nerdy, but don't worry, I'm not going to get too in-depth. Oops, sorry. So if any of my super nerd friends are here, I'm going to gloss over some basic details. Please try not to get triggered and get mad at me. I just want to make it more general for everybody. But this is what you would see as a typical classic gaming experience. This is an old console with composite video output going to a CRT. And how this works is like any other computer program in that it starts out as a bunch of digital ones and zeros. And then at some point, in most consoles, and I'll be using Super Nintendo as an example in this one, in most consoles, as soon as it turns analog for the first time, is in a video chip. And then in this video chip, the first thing that it's exited as is 3 main signals, red, green, and blue, and each of those signals containing their brightness and color information. Then there's a 4th signal called sync that carries all the information on where things go on screen. And I've already found the first problem with this presentation because I forgot to put sync on this. But imagine another 4th line right next to it. And this is generally just called RGB, even though technically it's RGBS. And when this signal finally leaves this console and it goes to a main amp chip where all those little color wires go to. And that does a few things. The first thing it does is prepare the RGB signal out for whatever devices can accept it. And up until recently, the only way you can get RGB from these consoles is by getting a SCART cable. There's other options now, but SCART was predominantly used in Japan and Europe. And you could technically get the best signal from your consoles. Now, I am assuming that this little picture of Link isn't scaling very well, so hopefully you could use your imaginations in this one. But after RGB, it is then processed. Those 3 colors are combined into chroma, and then the brightness and sync information is combined into luma, and that makes S-video. And generally speaking, S-video is a small step down from RGB, but still considered a very high quality signal. Then those 2 lines are combined into a cable we probably are all used to seeing, composite video. And the jump from S-video to composite is pretty large because you're getting a lot of interference from the color information that goes through there as well. Then finally is kind of an interesting signal called RF. I'll give a quick rundown because I could probably talk a lot about this, but it was a fairly ingenious idea of combining all of the video and audio signals into a broadcast signal that you're essentially broadcasting to the antenna input of your TV. And you can get a very wide variety of performance from RF, because if you live where I live in Manhattan and there's a million wireless signals around, it's gonna look terrible. But in every one of the presentations I did in a room like this, most people could not tell the difference between RF and composite. So still a perfectly good way to play in the right scenario. Now, in the context of what we're talking about here, I do want to mention component video, and it's the same quality as RGB, but not compatible in the context of retro gaming. So if you wanted to use RGB, you would either have to use something like an HD Retrovision cable that goes to component, or a transcoder that does the thing for you. You plug SCART in and get component out. But regardless of what those signals, or which of those signals you use, every single one of those signals takes exactly 0 milliseconds to get to the top left of a CRT, less than 1 millisecond to exit the console and start being drawn. It takes about 8 milliseconds to get to the middle, and then 16.9 milliseconds to complete the entire frame and then go back to the beginning. And that's exactly how a CRT works. It's a beam of light that's drawing a line, one line at a time from left to right. And your persistence of vision is what allows that to look like one full frame of data. And it's part of the original look and feel of these games, because this is how the developers designed the games to be played. So that overall is how these consoles work, how a CRT works very quickly, and what the classic experience is from a technical point of view. And that's kind of the whole thing that I'm aiming for, is that the classic gaming experience takes 0 lag from the time the signal exits the console to get to your CRT, and it's an image drawn by a beam of light shooting over the back of a piece of glass. Any CRT is a great way to experience the classic consoles. And that's the first point I want to make, is in most places you can still find CRTs for free. So if you're on a budget and you want to start gaming, if you already have your old console, grab any CRT whatsoever. Now, if you're lucky enough to find CRTs with other inputs, that's great. S-video is an awesome way to go. Or you could even mod certain CRTs, but I'll get back to that a little bit later. So basically, So the next step that you might want to go into, if you wanted a better quality image on your CRT, is things that are nicknamed RGB monitors. Now, there's 2 main differences between consumer-grade TVs that you would just find anywhere and RGB monitors. And the first is the amount of lines that are drawn. So that consumer-grade TV I just showed had about 250 lines to it. And your average RGB monitor can go from 600 to 1,000 lines. And that's a pretty noticeable difference. So that's the same 16.5 milliseconds as well. So if you imagine how many more lines can be drawn in, 250, 600, 1,000 in that same period of time, that's how you end up with more detail. Now, there's 2 types of the second point I wanted to make is that, generally speaking, RGB monitors have RGB inputs as well as S-video and composite. Some have mixed, some you need expansion cards for, but in general, you could pick one of these up and just start using your consoles with whatever cables you still own, and eventually upgrade to RGB once the budget allows. So now there's 2 types of RGB monitors you generally find. The first is PVMs, or professional video monitors. And these were used for things like medical imaging, security cameras, and basically places where you needed more detail on the screen. They range from $1,000 to $5,000, and today, while they're still skyrocketing in price, you could still find them for a few $100s, or much more if they've already been restored, but I'll touch upon that in a bit. The second type of RGB monitor you might see is BVMs, or broadcast video monitors. Now, these were precision instruments that were designed for TV studios to calibrate movies, and even for local TV networks to make sure that the signal you get at your house is as perfect as it can be. So it had to show as much detail as possible, as accurately as possible. And a picture I always like to show is George Lucas calibrating some very silly CGI scene on a BVM monitor, because that's the quality that he needed in order to pull that off. Now, these things, when they were new, ranged from $5,000 to $60,000. And nowadays, they're really ranging between $500 and more than I paid for my last car. But it's unfortunately too, because they're so rare, even compared to PVMs, the prices are going through the roof, even for not the greatest ones. But in all honesty, any CRT is a great way to experience it, and the better inputs or the better tube that you use inside is really just going to add sharpness. In my opinion, it doesn't add anything to the experience unless that really matters to you. So that's something that I heard a lot, is that people assume that you need an RGB monitor and a lot of expensive equipment to get the best experience. And best, once again, is just relative. So any CRT you could find is great, but I completely understand people in scenarios which they don't have the room for a CRT, they're too heavy, or they frankly just don't want to use a piece of equipment that's aging and gonna need restoration soon anyway. So that brings me to flat screen monitors. And flat screens introduce a few major problems that will never be able to be solved easily, at least probably not from the manufacturers. And the first is resolution. So your average classic game console is about 240 pixels tall, and you need to stretch that to whatever resolution it is that your TV is. And how you stretch it and how the signal is treated makes all the difference. So this is an example of what typically happens when you plug your console with anything from composite video to some other scalers, which I'll get to in a minute, into a TV, and it immediately processes the image wrong. It thinks that the 240 progressive signal that the game console is outputting is a 480 interlaced TV signal. And a few things happen. The first and most obvious is the aspect ratio. And on most TVs, you could just press a button to get in 4:3 mode. But it still introduces the problem that CRTs didn't have pixels. So some classic games are 320 pixels wide, others are 256, but they were always the same exact width on a CRT. So even if you put it in 4:3 mode, unless you use the correct processors, it's either going to be too narrow or too wide, depending. That's just the smallest gripe and the easiest to point out because of the picture, but the much more important thing to note is that when these progressive signals are processed as interlaced, a few things happen that, in my opinion, really ruin the experience. And the first is a flicker that I'm not going to be able to show with a still slide, and it's best probably shown with a slow motion camera. But it's one of those things that if you just take a glance at it, you wouldn't notice, but after an hour of playing, you're definitely going to have a headache. The other thing about processing progressive wrong is you get a weird blurring effect that happens whenever motion happens. So you could see the trees down below, and even Mario himself, and even the turtle shell, things that were moving when I snapped the screenshot, are all blurred in a weird way. And if you see this in motion, it's not just blurry, it just changes the look of the game. So the other problem is that many people, especially when there was no other options out there, used scalers that were designed for TV signals, and it did the same thing that the TVs themselves did. This scaler was designed for DVD players and stuff, and it does a very good job for that. But if you plug in your game console, it has all the same problems I just showed. Now, to make matters worse, there's some companies out there that are selling snake oil solutions that use those same exact chips that were designed for TV signals and marketing them for game consoles. And it stinks. Every industry always has their people trying to swoop in and take money from people, but it's just something you have to deal with, which stinks. Because if you didn't know anything about this and you saw these cables, it makes perfect sense that it would be the right thing to buy. So generally, if you're looking to pick up one of these things, anything that looks like this, with those vent holes and then the 4 screw holes, some of them have the HDMI cable built in, some don't, stay away from all of these. They will absolutely ruin the experience. And the other problem that a lot of these introduce is the way they scale the image. which is less of an issue, but still worth talking about. So I don't know if you could quite see that. Let me zoom in for a minute. So this is my silly face scaled the wrong way. So you can see how there's jagged edges on the side. This is how a video game should be scaled. So if you take a video game and scale it the way the other ones did, the way I should be scaled in this picture, it smooths the image out and changes the look. Not as big a deal, but something that's definitely worth mentioning. And the last thing is the blur about that. So this is kind of a better example of how it would get blurry in this scenario. And to be honest, if the other problems didn't exist, I would have never even mentioned this, maybe even just as an aside, because just the bit of blurring isn't experience ruining. But when you add it to all those other things, that's when it really starts to pile up. Now, the other thing that's not as much of an issue anymore, but still something you need to pay attention to, is lag. So all CRTs start out by adding almost no input latency, but your average flat screen has about 2.5 frames, 44 milliseconds of lag. You could get very good TVs with low lag. This is just a very cheap LG TV. So you don't have to spend a lot of money at all on that. And this is 5 milliseconds, way less than a frame. Perfectly good for retro gaming. But the thing to note is that your average modern TV, not so much the early flat screens, but your average modern one is very consistent at their latency. So even the slide before, it's my OLED TV at 44 milliseconds. I don't usually have a problem gaming on it because it's always 44 milliseconds. So you could kind of, even if you don't know it, you could subconsciously time your jumps and time your moves around that. And of course, the lower the latency, the better. But as long as you put your TV in game mode on a modern TV, you should be cool. But the scalar lag is the much bigger problem. So this is that same scaler that was designed for TV images, showing about 4.5, pushing 5 frames of lag. So if anybody doesn't know what you're looking at, on the left is just a direct signal from the Super Nintendo, and on the right is that signal split running through that scaler into an HD CRT. So you'll see that the one on the right is behind. So that's how, kind of an easier way to measure lag. And not only is this a lot of lag to deal with, but it varies. So this is that same scaler just a few seconds later showing 3.5 frames of lag. So that means it's impossible to time your jumps and to adjust to it because it's always changing. And to put this into perspective, you take your average TV with one of these scalers that's not designed for video games, and you're looking at 7 frames of variable lag. So unless you're playing like a turn-by-turn RPG, you can't ever adjust to that. And even if people don't realize that they're experiencing lag, which is actually very common, they just know at the end of the day they don't enjoy the game like they used to. Or if they're a newcomer, the game plays different than it should, and they usually don't like it as much. So one comparison that I like to make, that's a CRT on the left using RF as its input. And on the right is that scaler that's not designed for video games on a decent TV. I would, any day of the week, rather use RF, even if it was blurry and had some interference, on a CRT than RGB on a flat screen in a bad scaler. But there's some excellent choices out there, and there's only a few, which makes this very easy to remember afterwards. The screenshot on the left is showing the best scaler you can get today, and probably for the foreseeable future, at least 6 months to a year or so, as far as I know. And the one on the right is the same picture. And you could immediately tell all of the differences, even though it's not even in motion. And that scaler is called the Open Source Scan Converter, the OSSC. This is the higher end option, and it's about $150, maybe a little more after shipping. And this takes all of the best signals from your classic consoles and scales them up to 1080p and does everything perfect. Scales progressive as progressive, you dial in the perfect aspect ratio, and it really is a great device to use. If you just plug in your consoles and use it, it'll work fine. There are special patches you can download. A member of the retro gaming community named Firebrand X has been nice enough to do all the research and make it very easy to just put an SD card in, and you could get even better processing out of it by just using these pre-made profiles. The only thing to note is all modes aren't compatible with all TVs. So you should be fine if you buy one of these, but maybe like your Genesis would work in all modes, but your Super Nintendo might not work in 1080p. You might have to only use 720p. So still pretty great for experts. But the next option, the entry-level option, is something called the Rad2X, which has just been released. You can pre-order them now. They're $50, and they plug into your console. They take the RGB output of it, the best quality you could get, and double that to 480p. Now, it's not the sharpest option, but everything else is there. Zero lag, just like the OSSC. Scaling is absolutely perfect. And it's really designed for people who want to just start playing their games and not worry about anything else. And the same person that designed that, the processing board, Mike Chi, also designed the RetroTink 2X, which is essentially the same exact thing as the Rad2X, but it takes composite S-video and component video inputs. This is about $100, and it's a really great way to get started because you could just use whatever inputs or whatever cables that your console had with it. The one other thing I want to mention is the FrameMeister, because that's something some of you might even have and you've probably heard of. And if you own one, know that it's a great piece of equipment, and I still like it, but it was great for its time, and it's kind of been pushed aside by the other solutions. I just wanted to mention it because it's so often talked about. It's compatible with every single TV. It has every input you could imagine, but it's even though it's discontinued, you still get them for around $400. It adds about 1.5 frames of lag, and the colors aren't processed as good as the OSSC. So if you already own one, it's a great solution, but I wouldn't suggest going out and buying one just because of all those things. If you're a streamer, though, this might be a good option. So if there's any streamers in here, you could ask the questions after, and I'll kind of go into it. So the only last thing about playing on flat screens is that every signal that you send a TV or any digital solution, including a capture card, everything gets scaled. And that means that the interference as well as the game data will get scaled with it. So that's kind of why I said before about how the different signals you use on a CRT don't really matter for the experience, but composite video scaled up to 4K might kind of be distracting. And that brings us to one of the last things I want to talk about is restoration. And some things you might have heard, terms like RGB mods, RGB bypassing, and all that stuff, involve people wanting to get the best signals from their consoles so that when they scale them, they'll be able to see the clearest picture without any interference. And while I could talk about restoration for an entire 2 panels in itself, I'm just going to very quickly skim through so people get an idea of what I'm talking about. The first type of maintenance or restoration you might want to do is consoles like the SNES Mini or the earlier revisions of the Nintendo 64 that don't output RGB by themselves. These require a very simple chip like the one I'm showing here that you just solder a few wires, drop it on top of the pins, and poof, you get RGB. Now, there's some consoles like later revisions of the N64, the Nintendo, the original NES, and the Atari 2600, as well as a few others that require much more complicated mods. So it's something to think about if maybe using a RetroTink is more than enough for you, or maybe not, something you might want to look into. But then there's other mods for crazy people like me that are RGB bypassing. And this is something where you take the output of like a one-chip Super Nintendo, the later models that are very good quality. If you put that through an OSSC on a 4K TV, it's gonna look great, but you might still notice a little bit of imperfections. And if that bothers you, you could remove the pins right where those RGBS signals first leave the chip, right when I talked about before. You could lift those pins up and get the direct signal right from that. And that way you could put it through this amplifier here and many others like it that use audiophile and videophile grade stuff on it to process the image as best as possible. Now, it would have been silly for Nintendo to include this because in the 90s, there's no way you could have seen this data. But when you're stretching that tiny little image to 4K, you might notice a difference. Now, bypassing a Super Nintendo is by no means mandatory. It's really just for the crazies like me. However, consoles like the Sega Genesis have a lot of interference. And it's something that, once again, won't ruin the experience, but might be distracting. So one of my favorite mods to do is called the triple bypass, where you bypass the video, audio, and even the output DIN connector of a Genesis 1 and install this board. And you get pretty much as perfect of an output as you could expect from a classic console. And while I wouldn't call that mandatory, if the Genesis is your favorite console and you're gaming on a digital solution, it's something you might want to look into. But there are mandatory mods out there. And the number one that I would say is whenever you have bad capacitors, you need to address that right away. Capacitors are components with fluid inside that when they get old, sometimes they dry out and other times they leak. And when they leak, it has a fluid on it that if left untouched, will eat through the motherboard to the point where it is unfixable. So consoles like the original Game Gear, Turbo Express, Turbo Duo, original Xbox, and there's a long list of others that I'll hopefully have up on the website soon. If you own one of these, you need to open it up and check it out. Now, if you're not a modder, that's fine. You could just unbolt it, carefully take it apart and snap some pictures. And if yours looks like this with some leaky gunk all over it, you really absolutely have to replace those right away. Otherwise, your console will just get ruined. Now, TVs also have capacitors in them that start to die. That's my friend Jose, who I constantly bother to help me do this stuff with. And luckily, most TVs and RGB monitors I've seen, when the capacitors die, they just dry out. They don't leak out. But if you want to get the best image out of it, or if you do find them leaking, you'll have to replace those as well. And I do also want to tell everybody, I always say this, if you're going to work on TVs, be very, very careful. There's zero chance of injury when you mod a Super Nintendo unless you do something very silly like mod it in the bathtub with it plugged in. But on TVs, if you don't discharge them properly, you have a very good chance of getting electrocuted, and if you have heart problems, you could get zapped, and that's terrible. So please don't get injured. But if you do want to restore those, you could replace the capacitors and get a much better image out of it. And you could even do things like add RGB inputs. So you get the best signal from the console going directly into the tube. And to be honest, I've seen a lot of CRTs with these mods, and I'm always blown away at how good they look. So it's kind of neat to do. And you would end up with something like that. So one of the things that I always like to bring up when I tell these is, if you like working on stuff, this could be a fun thing. You know, you could make this a family or friend project where you restore your TV, you add an RGB mod, you mod all your consoles, and you know, that's totally cool if that's what you like to do. But I completely understand if anybody here is listening to this going, I don't want to deal with all that. I just want to play some games. So if that's the case, just make good choices. Exactly like which cables to use on a flat screen, which clone consoles or other solutions to use on a CRT or a flat screen matters the most. So those, I hate to always pick on them, but those HDMI Retron consoles will get you a bad experience for all the exact reasons I just explained. Lag, processed image wrong, and all that stuff. But you can get good software emulation for free if you want to just download and deal with some emulators. My favorite for the classics are FPGA solutions. So this is a picture of the DE10 Nano, which is used in the Mister. If you like do-it-yourself projects, if you just want to buy something, plug it into your flat screen and go. The company Analog makes some really great stuff that's designed by Kevtris, who's a friend of mine and a really great engineer that reverse engineers these consoles to be pretty close to flawless. So definitely wanted to just add that at the end in case this is getting a little crazy. So the very last point I want to make is the fact that you're here at all is really awesome because you're learning about this stuff and you could decide if it's for you or not. Maybe you'd find even a better way to explain this to your friends. But it is a bit annoying to me that you have to know this at all. TV manufacturers should have thought of gamers right when they started making flat screens. Companies shouldn't exist to try to take advantage of us by selling us TV chips and gaming cables, but it is what it is, and we gotta kind of just deal with it. So I'll get ready to take questions in a minute. I just wanted to first, before I forget, like I sometimes do, thank you everybody once again for coming. And just remind everybody that if you like hearing about this stuff and you want more behind the scenes research and stuff done, please consider supporting through any of the services like Patreon or Subscribestar, because we have an amazing team working for Retro RGB, and I'd like to keep this going as long as possible. So I have time for a bunch of questions if anybody is interested. Yep.
I have about 15 students. My
Great question. So for people that have multiple displays, how do you decide what consoles to use on what displays? The honest answer is whatever your eyes prefer. So a silly example is I grew up playing Neo Geo in the arcades, never at home. We had, I think, a Sony TV at home, which is the Aperture Grill, and most arcade monitors used Shadow Mask. So every time I want to play Neo Geo, I make sure to grab my CRT that has that type of tube in it, because that's what my eyes want to see. There's no wrong answer to that. It's really just what you prefer.
You were talking about the FrameMeister versus the OSSC for streaming. You want to get a little bit more into that? I stream retro games.
Sure. So the FrameMeister is compatible with every single capture card out there. And if it's not compatible with one, I've certainly never heard about it. Also, the same person, Firebrand X, has made some incredible profiles for that as well. So as a streamer, you might use something like the G-SCART switch that has dual outputs, or there's other ways to split your output, but it's very common for streamers to game on a CRT, and then stream through HDMI. So if that's the case, your colors are going to get compressed on the internet anyway. The 1.5 frames of lag doesn't matter because you're streaming. So that is just the easiest way to get every single input out to your capture card. Now it's expensive, and there's other ways to do it that are way more complicated. So if you don't mind spending the money, it's a plug and play solution. If you really want to dig into getting crazy streaming perfect signals, you could do direct RGB inputs and do some of the stuff I do, but it's really just how much time you want to spend versus how much money you want to spend. But yeah, that is a perfect solution for many streamers still. Yep. Okay.
Oh, sorry.
No, go for it.
Okay, an Amiga 500,
Okay.
But it's a PAL version from Britain. I've got it working now. And I have an NTSC Commodore 1080 monitor. I saw a bunch of them down on the floor. And somebody said, hey, you should talk to Bob because that one will auto switch from the PAL signal to the NTSC on its own. I don't know if that's true. I don't see a switch on the back of it. They say it will auto switch. And he would know how to get the cable from that interesting DIN connector at the back of the monitor into that Amiga.
Okay, so there's two answers to that. Go ahead and try PAL or NTSC on it. Like the best example is a PVM. If you put a PAL signal in it, it just works perfect. If it doesn't work, it won't hurt it to try. I wouldn't leave it running, but it's not going to kill it if you just try to give it the signal. So just go right ahead and see. And as far as the cable, I'm not familiar with that exact model. Check retrogamingcables.uk or something like that. Just Google it, it'll be the first one that comes up. And if they don't have a cable, you could try to research the output of the DIN and have another company called Retro Access out of the US try to make a custom cable for you. But that's pretty much, you just have to do a little bit of research on that, or just talk to me after and maybe I can take a look at it for you.
Thank you.
No problem. Yeah, the question I missed before, sorry.
Do you think we're going to see direct HDMI mod solutions for the Super Nintendo and Genesis like we see with the Dreamcast and the Super 4 and NES?
So the question is, can you get a direct HDMI output from Genesis and Super Nintendo like you would Dreamcast and the NES? And the answer is no, because of the way the data is processed. The other consoles that have those are able to tap into the digital signals while they're still ones and zeros, like I showed the Matrix picture before. And that's how you're able to get an HDMI mod that's perfect like that. What you would have to do for Super Nintendo or Genesis is essentially build in an OSSC, which seems like a lot of work when you could just buy an OSSC. So great question, but no. Yes, so can you use a computer monitor with retro consoles? So this is all the frequency. So before I said CRTs don't have pixels, but they do have frequency response. So RGB monitors are 15 kilohertz, VGA are 31 and above. So you would have to have a converter to convert the signal. And the best one is actually OSSC. You just take the HDMI out and put it through a VGA dongle. Yeah, they're really great solutions too. So that's definitely something you could do. But you won't be able to use light guns. You probably won't be able to use the Sega 3D glasses. So if that doesn't matter to you, it's totally cool. But yeah, it's a good solution. Yeah.
Can that solution really be as fast as a line doubler? And are there any line doublers that you know of for VGA that you like?
The OSSC, yeah, that's zero lag and goes from old to new. Did I hear your question right? I'm sorry.
Yeah, the OSSC output, does it output VGA?
No, HDMI, but anytime you have direct signal conversion from digital to analog or analog to digital with no other processing, generally speaking, it's zero lag. So that lag test picture, the first ones I showed with the little monitor and the time sleuth, that's actually running through an HDMI to component converter and obviously showing zero lag still. So you can get, I think 10DAC is the brand that I've been using for, I think it's $15 or something. So it's just HDMI to VGA, and that's the exact way you would do it. And it looks really good too. The one video I'm gonna do soon is if you add scan lines a certain way, you could even make the VGA monitor look like an RGB monitor. And it's absolutely a worthy solution that looks awesome. So.
After outputting on a computer, you can output 240p at 120 hertz, and you still get this 240p scan line.
Back there.
My current main retro console is a PS2, and I also play PS1 games on it. And I'm currently running that through a Sony Trinitron CRT TV, and I'm getting a really good image out of it. Given what you said during the panel, what would you recommend would be like the next step to like take, to get an even better image out of it?
So it's a PS2 that you're running PS1 and 2 games directly via component into your flat screen?
No, it's a CRT TV.
Into your CRT. I mean, that's awesome. What was the next step you were looking to go to? Flat screens or different monitors or?
Possibly getting a better image out of the CRT TV or just running it on my flat screen.
So you could look into RGB monitors that also accept 480p. Those are generally really expensive, so if you have the space, I would just go get a VGA monitor, and whenever your PS2 goes into 480p mode, use a converter, just same type of zero lag signal converter, and then, you'd have to change the wires when you play, but once the game's loaded, it stays in 480p, and that's a pretty cheap and easy way to get a better picture for all the PS2 480p games that support it. But just a quick note that most of the PS2 library is 480i, which is fine on a CRT, but if you use it on a flat screen, you start to get that interlaced jitter.
That's the thing I'm worried about.
Yeah, so stick with the CRT, definitely. To go the opposite though, you could boot your game in, you could just get a component video cable and only use your flat screen when you're playing 480p games. That certainly would be a good one. And on Amazon, the HD Retrovision cable, it's the best one out there. It's rated up to 1080p with screenshots of scope captures to prove that it actually does what they say it is. So,
Cool.
Back there.
I was wondering what devices would be a good option for like 480p, maybe like a Nintendo Wii or maybe an Xbox 2 onto like an HDMI only 4K flat panel, and what's a good option for like consoles that route VGA to like Dreamcast to HDMI?
So same thing as before, anytime you're just going from analog to digital, you can just get cheap converters on Amazon for $20 that just change it from analog to digital. You get zero lag added. Some of them are okay. You might notice a little thing with the colors, but it's by no means experience ruining. There's no lag, it doesn't mess anything up. So those are the best. And same thing with the Dreamcast. You can get the plug and play solutions. HD Retrovision's coming out with their cable 2 years ago. It'll be out soon enough. But the DC HDMI, the internal HDMI mod's pretty spectacular. If Dreamcast is your favorite console, that's definitely the one to go to. Yeah. Yep.
Is there like a specialty CRT industry right now? Is there no one producing CRTs anymore?
No one's producing new CRTs because they're really hard to make. So it's unfortunately just. You could restore ones that are already there, but rewinding and setting a yoke, I mean, you're talking about a long-term project. So I think I have time for one more question. So with the hat, sorry.
Yeah, I was interested in modeling, but I've done very little software. So I'm asking if you might have a suggestion for a project that is easy, maybe inexpensive, something that you can see the results from, maybe just 2 or 3 projects.
Yeah, great question to end on. If you want to get into modding, The easiest one that I know of is the Super Nintendo RGB mod or the N64 one. The Super Nintendo Mini one is easier because when you put the wires through the holes, it's nothing on the other side, so if it goes too far, you just turn the board over and snip them. With the N64, if it goes too far, you could short out the chip on the other side, but in most cases, you just pull the wire back out and it's fine. So the SNES Mini, if you want to get started, and if you have any dead electronics around your house, open them up and see if they call them vias, the little holes. See if they have ones that look the same, and just practice on some dead electronics. So, okay, doors are open. I guess we're out of time. So thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it.